So today we are here to talk about one of my favorite cities, right? And that is Bangalore. For somebody like me who's grown up in Bangalore, who's born in Bangalore, grown up in Bangalore, and I've spent the most number of years of my life in Bangalore, of course, having lived in a few other cities in other places of the world, home is Bangalore. There's no other big city in the world that I would rather live in but for Bangalore. Why do I say this? Well, there are very, very few cities on this planet that can claim a meteoric rise that Bangalore has seen, say in the last couple of centuries, right? Um, Recently, it was voted as one of the most dynamic cities in the world, one of the fastest growing cities in Asia. If you look at it in the Indian context, it's probably one of the most tech savvy cities in the country. It says the most millennial friendly city, known for its tech startups, known for its pop culture. Well, in short, it's a city that works hard and parties hard. And of course, great weather. We'll not be talking about traffic today. So here, over the next an hour, let's talk about the story of Bangalore. Four cities in a city. Namma Bengaluru Narratives, we call this. Let's look at the journey of Bangalore, the story of Bangalore, to the four cities that exist within the city, right? And let's start the story with the story of the name of Bangalore, name of the city. The story goes that somewhere in the 1300s was a king, Veeraballala, who got lost on a hunting trip in the wild. He was completely lost, famished, did not know what to do, and there he bumped into this old lady in a hut who cooked him a pot of baked beans. And so happy with his gesture, they say he named the city of baked beans, Bengaluru or Bangalore. Great story, isn't it? Well, that's exactly what this is, because there is no historical proof for this particular word coming from baked beans. But what we do have from history is this inscription in one of the temples of Bangalore, that the word Bangalore was used in probably the 1800s. That's the oldest known date where we find the usage of the word Bangalore. But if you look at Bangalore, probably one of the earliest heroes of the city, if I may call, is this gentleman, Mr. Kempe. Well, our international airport is named after him. In the 1500s, he's known as the founding father of Bangalore. Quite a dynamic personality, I would say, because what he started with Bangalore was a very interesting concept. This is an old map of the city, right? And what do you see here? In the bottom here, you have a little fort that he built, Kempe, and around it, in the front, you see a little marketplace, right? That back in the day was called the Kote, which was the fort, and Pete, which was the market, right? This, let's call the first city of Bangalore, the oldest city of Bangalore. Let's call it Old Bangalore. You still see, of course, the remnants of the fort even today. If those of you haven't been to the oldest part of Bangalore, this is how the fort looks like. Not too big, a modest fort. That's probably representative of how the city would have been a few hundred years ago, right? And if you move on from the fort, and what you see is this really interesting marketplace, right? This Bangaloreans very fondly call Chickpete, but Chickpete is just one part of this marketplace. If you look deeper, you'll see all these different marketplaces coming together, all these different markets coming together. You have Akkipete, where rice was sold, Uparpete, where salt was sold, or Balepete, where bangles were sold. So pretty much this pete area was a mix of a bunch of different small petes, where you pretty much had different goods being sold. And if you wonder, how did this division in pete happen? It is based on caste. There's a particular caste that was selling the rice, a particular caste selling bangles. So even today, if you go to Chickpete, you will find a lot of these nook and corners, still these old petes, and you still see a lot of the descendants of the original inhabitants of the city following the same profession, right? Chickpete. But there's something else Kempe Goddard did. He got hold of 4 oxens early in the morning at daybreak. He got them to the center of the city, the old Chickpede, and he let them loose. And wherever they ended up at sunset, and that he marked as the city of Bangalore. And in each of these 4 places, he built a tower, what we today call the Kempe Goddard Towers. The most iconic of them stands in Lal Bagh, which also happens to be the symbol of our city corporation, BBMP, right? But the city never really got to the extent that Kempe Goddard envisioned, right? It really stayed in what we call Chickpete today, the old Bangalore. And those of you who are wondering, how does Chickpete look? Well, here's a little glimpse. Narrow alleys, constantly fighting for a space in these nooks and corners of Chickpete, and one of the corners of a bustling market, the city market. Vegetables. Really, it's a riot of colors that treat your eyes, right? The Kyar market. But if you look deeper into Chickpete, like I said, a lot of these nooks and corners, you still have the descendants of the early settlers of Bangalore still following their profession. So here are a bunch of goldsmiths practicing their profession. And you'd see this in one part of Chickpete. You only have rows and rows of just goldsmiths on it, right? It's a beautiful sight to watch. All your flashy showrooms in the city, jewelry showrooms, all the back-end work is happening here in Chickpete. So you'd see a large cluster of such jewelers in Chickpete. But something else that you'd see in Chickpete, again, a large cluster, especially for manufacturing in these narrow alleys, is what you will see next. Listen closely, because you're going to walk through a narrow alleyway. Listen to the sound that you hear. And tell me, there's something that comes to your mind as to what is being manufactured there. Here, take a look. Narrow alley. We're walking down this narrow alley. And you'd find this in a lot of different places in Chickpete, right? Exactly this repeated beating of these machines. I'm guessing some of you would have already taken a guess, but let's enter this little room and find out what's being made, right? There you go. Working on their looms. This is a closer photograph of the weaver on his machine. At one point in time, there were more than 10,000 such weavers in Chickpete. Today, there are about a little more than 1,500 weavers left. Bangalore still happens to be one of the largest textile clusters in the country. But there's something a little more fascinating about these weaving clusters, and especially the machine that he is using. Take a closer look, right? These are little carts, right? You see them moving. They've got little holes in there. And through that, you see there's a whole mesh of these threads that are coming down. And in the corner, that helps dictate the border of the sari, right? This particular machine is called the Jacquard Loom. Why? It was a French engineer who came up with this fantastic design where if you just change these cards, the design in the fabric changed. Well, fantastic, isn't it? But this particular machine inspired another machine that we use every day today all across the world. right? And it's pretty much changed all our lives. Any of you want to take a guess in your heads as to which is that modern day machine I'm talking about? Well, it's the modern day computer. That's right. Charles Babbage, the father of modern day computer, was inspired by this very weaving machine, the Jacquard Loom, and that's how he came up with the computer, the binaries, the zeros and the one. Wherever you have the hole, the thread goes in and makes the design. It's the same for computers, the zero and the one, the binary, and the old punching cards. The old initial computers had the punching cards, and today, you see, that was the birth of the modern day computer. So I'd like to believe what we see as the tech capital of India today probably had its inspiration in the old city, in Chikpet. But moving on from these punching cards, today if you look at Chikpet, all of us would have probably visited Chikpet at some point or the other, know this place for being a busy marketplace, right? Always crowded. You always go in there for some transaction or the other, and this is a place which even today commands the highest real estate in the entire city. A square foot in Chikpet goes up to more than 50,000 to 75,000, even more. That for Western audience is close to about $1,000, right? This is really the hub of the economic activity of the city, right? But what if I told you this very area, the old Bangalore, the Chikpet area, what I call the first city of Bangalore, was once a bloody battleground, right? And I say a bloody battleground for this. Let's look at these two personalities, Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan. These two were kings of the erstwhile state of Mysore, who just snatched power from the Hindu king. And the second half of the 1500s, they really went on to set up and expand this kingdom of Mysore, of which Bangalore was a part of. Very ambitious kings, I would say. And their capital was this place called Srirangapatna, not too far from Bangalore. Let's look at this map of Mysore. I'm talking about the second half of the 1700s. The British, who already made a presence in India, they have their presence felt in Bengal and Madras, and they're eyeing Mysore very, very keenly. And if you're wondering why the British are so keen on Mysore, well, the answer lies in the map. Whoever controlled Mysore controlled a long coastline and two powerful ports, both Mangalore and Mahe, and that's where the bulk of the spice trade took place. So whoever controlled Mysore controlled the coastline, and which is why Hyder and Tipu were engaged with wars with the British, right? Not one, not two, but there were 4 great wars fought in this region. Why do I talk about these wars? Because it's at the end of these wars you really see the role that Bangalore goes on to play. Of these 4 wars, the first and the second war was won by the father and the son, right? They were victorious. But at the same time, halfway across the world, America was a British colony. And Americans in the 1770s would go on to revolt against the empire. They throw some tea off the coast in Boston, very famously called the Boston Tea Party. It's the first time ever that Native Americans are revolting against a strong colonial power. And a few years later, the American army, led by George Washington, defeats the English army, led by this gentleman called Lord Cornwallis. Why do I talk about Lord Cornwallis? Because after his defeat in America, Lord Cornwallis' next posting is in India, and he comes to Bangalore. And he thinks it's a great chance for him to regain his lost glory. And he would waste no time, and he would wage this battle against Tipu. The battle is fought in Bangalore, in Nandidurg, and in Chikpet. That's when I talked about the bloody battle scene. And eventually it'll end up in Srirangapatna, where they would defeat Tipu. And as a part of the booty, they would take away half his kingdom, asking for a huge annual royalty. And they also take away 2 of his sons as hostages. And thinking they've finished Tipu, he's surrendered now, Lord Cornwallis goes back. little knowing that Tipu is not given up yet. Uh, he goes on to wage another war, the last and the final war of Srirangapatna. And for this war, this young gentleman, an Englishman, in fact, an Irishman called Arthur Wellesley, comes to India, comes to Bangalore, and through Bangalore gets to Mysore to fight the last Anglo-Mysorean war. And in this war, Tipu is not just defeated, but killed. And Arthur Wellesley goes on to become the first commissioner of Mysore, of course, holding on to the territory of Bangalore as well. And the Hindu king is brought back to power, and the British take control. Why do I talk of Arthur Wellesley? Because he's the same person who defeats Napoleon in the Battle of Waterloo years later in Europe. And now you can imagine how events around the world, what's happened in America, what's happened in Europe, and what's happened in Bangalore are all interconnected. Once Tipu is defeated, the British decide to settle down in Srirangapatna. They think it's quite a safe place, surrounded by water, makes for a great fort. Why don't we settle down in Srirangapatna? But there's a small problem. The British see a lot of deaths in their troops, even after the war. And a lot of these deaths is because of this particular disease called malaria. And because the water around the fort, it only made matters worse. Like they say, the mighty British Empire fell for the tiny mosquito. And this is when the British decided they need to relocate out of Srirangapatna, right? But where would they relocate? There were 4 options that they considered. One was Chittradurga in Karnataka. The other was Sira. The third place was Hosu. And the fourth was Bangalore. Now, of all these 4 places, why was Bangalore chosen? Well, there were a couple of factors in Bangalore's favor. One, the proximity to Madras, where the British were stationed in the south of India. And 2, it already had a robust trading space, what we saw in old Bangalore, Chickpet. That I'm guessing surely combined with weather, Bangalore was chosen as the next British cantonment. So the British troops moved from Srirangapatna and settled down in Bangalore in the 1800s. And that is when the story of Bangalore, the story of the rise of Bangalore begins. And that's the story of our second city. Let's call this the British Bangalore. So the British come to Bangalore. You're seeing the fort and the Pete in one corner. And they're going to set up what is called the cantonment for the British troops. Right? Cantonment is modern today MG Road, Brigade Road, and the places surrounding that area. A closer look at the map, you really get to see. In fact, the ground right next to MG Road is called Parade Ground, even today. That's where the troops took their parade. And all these English-sounding names, whether it's Richmond Town, Cleveland Town, Cook Town, all these roads, whether it's Cunningham Road, Brigade Road, Residency Road, Richmond Road, that's when really the British made their home in this part of Bangalore, the cantonment. Cantonment is really an army territory, an army area, men in uniform, right? So even today, you'd see a remnants of this in Bangalore, all the barracks in and around MG Road. Like I said, even the names of roads in this region, whether it's Brigade Road or Artillery Road, still go back to cantonment road set up in the early 1800s. But just think of this for a moment. More than 200 years ago, if you were a soldier in the English army, you got on a ship in England, sailed for about 6 months, came to an alien land like India. The food's different, the weather, the people, the language, and you got to fight wars. And if you survived, well, here you were in a cantonment like Bangalore. Well, in times like this, that's when I guess you think of the Almighty all the more. And that's exactly what you saw in the cantonment area. You saw a lot of these churches that sprung up. This is a photograph of the St. Mark's Church in Bangalore on MG Road. One of the oldest churches in the city, also the cathedral, the main church. There's also a hierarchy in this church, in these churches that was going on. If you were a high-ranking British officer, you went to the St. Mark's Church. If you're a low-ranking officer, you were in the church on the other side of MG Road, the Trinity Church. If you're a Scottish soldier, you went to St. Andrews on Cubbon Road. If you were an Irish soldier, you went to St. Patrick's down Brigade Road. Or if you were one of those Indians who took Christianity, then you went to the East Parade Church. So if you look at cantonment, you have these churches all across, and each of these churches played a particular role. But now that the cantonment is set up, it was in the 1800s that you really saw Bangalore blossom as a city. And a person who was responsible for a lot of it was this gentleman called Sir Mark Cubbon, who came to India in his early 20s, joined the establishment as a low-ranking officer, and eventually became the Commissioner of Bangalore. Did a lot of great things for the city, setting up roads, reducing corruption in the establishment, including encouraging the silk weavers in the city. We in Bangalore probably associate Mark Cubbon with one of the greenest lung spaces in the city, Cubbon Park, right? We have a road named after Mark Cubbon. We have a place in Chickpet called Cubbonpet named after him. We have a lot of places named after Mark Cubbon, but like I said, the most recognizable of them all is this park in the heart of the city. Mark Cubbon never left India through his entire service. And eventually when he left, it was only after he completed his service and he decided to sail back to England. And he was also single all his life. He never married. And on his way back to England, while crossing the Suez, he would pass away. Right? He would pass away. In his remembrance, Bangaloreans got together, put together a fund, and they commissioned this beautiful equestrian statue. It was an Italian sculptor, a renowned Italian sculptor in the 1800s called Carlo Marochetti, who was given this assignment. And finally, you see this beautiful equestrian statue in front of the High Court and now in Cubbon Park. Right? Probably one of these men whose contributions to Bangalore is immense. But a couple of years ago, this lovely couple who came from the Isle of Man, a little island in England, the same place where Mark Cubbon came, and they spent 2 full days in Bangalore just tracing remnants of Mark Cubbon. There was Cubbon Road, Cubbon Park, Cubbonpet, including where this photo was taken. The governor's residence was built by Mark Cubbon, and it was his residence. And I was curious, and I asked this couple, why all this curiosity with Mark Cubbon? And they told me, with his pension money, Mark Cubbon went on to build cottages, or rather, asked the money to be used to build cottages in the Isle of Man for the poor, and he called these cottages the Mysore cottages. In fact, there's also a book that the lady is holding. It says, From Man to Mysore. So I'm guessing Mark Cubbon's legacy still lives on. Right? Talking about legacies, here's another person, a colorful personality, I must say, who lived in my Bangalore. So Winston Churchill. Churchill lived in Bangalore for about 4 years, from 1896 to 1900. And he was a low-ranking British officer, right? And he really, I'm guessing, took to Bangalore weather because he really enjoyed playing polo. It was also here that he fell in love for the first time. He fell in love with this lady who was the daughter of the resident of Hyderabad, the neighboring state, and the resident being the senior-most officer, the senior-most British officer in the region. And he wrote these long love letters to his lady love. And when the resident got to know about this affair, he summoned Churchill, asking him, what's the matter? When Churchill would confess his love for his daughter or ask if he could marry her, the resident would refuse. And the reason given was the boy does not have bright prospects. Well, Churchill still continued writing his letters to her, and his last letter was written as the Prime Minister of England after the Second World War, when she had lost two of her children in the war. Well, I'm guessing Bangalore was also a place for romance. But the world remembers Churchill as the most functional alcoholic, right? And I'm guessing it was this incident that probably made him hit the bottle hard. And his favorite place in Bangalore was the Bangalore Club, where he'd probably go for his gin and tonic. When Churchill left Bangalore, he left with an unsettled bill of rupees 13. So even today, if you're at the Bangalore Club, it's very evidently displayed there that Churchill owes them rupees 13. The story doesn't end here. In the 90s, when Prince Charles was visiting Bangalore, when he was at the Bangalore Club, on taking a look at the register, of course, Churchill being the most famous Englishman, he wanted to settle the outstanding amount, which is about 30,000 rupees back in the 90s. But Bangalore Club refused. It does more good to them, as Churchill being the most famous defaulter, than settling his dues at the club. The reason I'm talking about characters like Mark Cubbon and Churchill, I'm talking about people who spent time in Bangalore and the remnants of the British Bangalore that you could see today, right? When you're talking about these military men, you cannot not talk about the Madras Sappers or the MEGN Center. One of the oldest regiments in the country, set up in the 1780s, right? Their cadets are called the Thambis, which in Tamil is a brother, because a lot of these recruits come from Tamil Nadu. So, like I said, set up in the 1780s. There's another aspect of British Bangalore that you would see in cantonment. To support the Britishers, a lot of the auxiliary forces, a lot of the Indians who were commissioned were not from the state of Karnataka, but from the state of Tamil Nadu. Right? They were all Tamil speaking, and that's why you see such a strong Tamil influence in cantonment, in and around Alsur and places like that. Right? But the Thambis and Madras Sappers, the MEG and group, were known for their bravado. Their fort was all across, right from the opium wars in China to wars in Mesopotamia, in Syria, in Egypt, and even the World War I. And which is why at the end of Brigade Road, you'd see this little memorial, which is a memorial to the Madras Sappers and their contribution to the Great War. But I guess the contribution they're most remembered for around the world is for this particular device, the Bangalore Torpedo. What is the Bangalore Torpedo? The Bangalore Torpedo is a weapon used extensively in World War I and World War II during the trench warfare. It was used to blow out the barbed wire fences so that you could march ahead to the enemy lines. Probably the most iconic representations of the Bangalore Torpedo is in this movie called The Saving Private Ryan, where Tom Hanks pulls out the Bangalore Torpedo so it could be used in war. And this was during the Normandy landings in the Second World War. But Bangalore is just not about military men and fighting wars, right? There is definitely more to Bangalore. Here is a photograph of another gentleman, Ronald Ross, Sir Ronald Ross. Stationed in Bangalore, he was a doctor in the British Army, stationed in MEGN Center. He would get to Cubbon Park every morning for his round of tennis. But what the world remembers him for the cure of the disease malaria. That's right. Until then, the world believed that malaria came from bad air. Mal was bad and area was air. But it was Sir Ronald Ross who thought differently. After his dinners at the officers' mess in MEG, he would see trays laden with leftover food. left in the open in the lawn. And when he would come back the next morning, he would see that moisture had collected on these trays and little mosquitoes on them. And he always had a hunch that these mosquitoes had something to do with the disease, the deadly disease back then called malaria. So he decided to investigate this further. He got hold of a local called Hussein Khan, put him in a mosquito net, and offered to pay him 1 anna for every mosquito bite. And that's how he figured out that it was the female Anopheles mosquito which is responsible for malaria. And that's how he produced the vaccine for which he was given the Nobel. Talking about what is left of British Bangalore today, or the remnants of British Bangalore today, and how else do we get a feel of British Bangalore today beyond these military establishments? Is a series of educational institutions. Right? This is the St. Joseph's Boys High School, but you'd see with the onset of Christian missionaries onto Indian soil and in cantonment towns like Bangalore, you see a lot of these educational institutions prop up, whether it's Bishop Cotton Boys and Girls, Baldwin Boys and Girls, Sophia's, the list goes on. But the education institutions set up by the missionaries still stand strong today. So you'd see a strong colonial influence in these educational institutions. On one hand is education, and whereas we see a strong colonial influence is in the pub culture of Bangalore. Right? This again goes back to colonial times when the sturdy Tommy would want to have a drink. Back in the day, he would escape to old Bangalore and would have spurious liquor, which we call arak, and it wasn't doing good for his body. That's when the establishment decided that why don't they introduce tap beer and bottled beer into Bangalore. And that's when you saw the rise of the drinking and the pub culture in Bangalore. Today, Bangalore boasts to have one of the highest number of pubs in India. And it's not just Bangalore, just the cantonment area that has more than 1,000 pubs, which is the highest in the country, right? And one of these places in Bangalore where you really get a feel of British Bangalore even today, the colonial era, is this place called Koshi's. Yeah, those of you who haven't been to Koshi's, here's a little video where you get an idea as to how this place is. Right? Known for its good coffee, beer, and some complimentary food. It's really popular with Twitter chatting. The people in Bangalore go to Koshi's. It's as though Koshi's is stuck in time. But like I said, you really get an idea as to how life would have been back in the day. They've served the Queen of England, Pandit Nehru, so on and so forth. But like I said, one of these last remaining institutions of this era called the British Bangalore Era. Right? If we're just talking about the British who settled down in Bangalore and all their supporting ancillary stuff, but where were the locals? Where were the Kannada-speaking locals? Well, they were on the other side of cantonment, right? Because everything that you see in cantonment is a reflection of the British era. Things like the well-mannered gentlemen, like these old houses, colonial houses, or movie theaters like BRV, which today is a military canteen, or movie theaters like Plaza, which was once a dancing hall, then became a movie theater, and now a metro station. Right? And these lovely sketches are by one of the most popular artists from Bangalore called Paul Fernandez. Really gives you an idea as to how Bangalore would have been during the British era. Like I said, you're only looking at the British Bangalore. But like my question is, what happened to the locals? Where were the locals? Well, the locals were on the other side of the cantonment. What you see here, Shamrajpet, then Baswangudi and Janagar, all of it, including Malleshwaram, was that part of Bangalore where you had the local population. And I'm also guessing it was by design, because this part of Bangalore was controlled by the Maharaja. And back in the day, it was strictly regulated. If you had to leave uh, traditional Bangalore and get into British Bangalore, you had to get a little permit, and only then you could enter. And it was both ways. It was almost like it was a different word, traditional Bangalore, which is our city number 3. If you look at traditional Bangalore, it's sprinkled with temples. This is probably one of the most famous temples of traditional Bangalore, what we call South Bangalore. It's Bull Temple. Just like how you have uh, a good number of churches in cantonment, on the other side, you'd see a good number of temples, right? Um, the culture is quite palpable here. Here, where you see the traditional Kannadiga. It has traditional robes going about during his day. It's just not the temple that's reflective of traditional Bangalore here. It's also the food, right? Like what you're seeing, the masala dosa. Probably some of the best masala dosas, not just in town, not just in the country, but some would argue some of the best masala dosas in the world are found in this part of Bangalore. Really known for its South Indian delicacies, whether it's the masala dosas, the idlis. If you really would like a good South Indian breakfast, this is where you'd get to, the south of Bangalore, right? What I call traditional Bangalore, right? Apart from the South Indian delicacies, something else that's pretty much a religion in this part of Bangalore is the filter coffee, which is nothing but a coffee concentrate mixed with sugary, frothy milk that gives you this lovely drink called the filter coffee that most Bangaloreans would swear by, right? There's also here that you saw the origin of Baitu coffee. And what's Baitu coffee? Well, no Bangalorean needs an explanation for this. But if any of you here are not from Bangalore, that's when you order for 1 cup of coffee and split it by 2 people, right? And the story goes that this got popular in traditional Bangalore, especially a lot of these students who couldn't afford a full coffee by themselves would go with another friend and split the coffee. Coffee for South Bangalore is more than a beverage. I would say it's very much their identity. If you're meeting people in South Bangalore, irrespective of what time of the day it is, their greeting would be in the local language, coffee aita, which means have you had a coffee, which literally translates to how you doing, right? So you swear by the filter coffee in South Bangalore, but in cantonment, you're looking for your beer. You're seeing the contrast between the different cities of Bangalore. But if you're also looking at South Bangalore, it is really where you have a lot of the literary greats. Kannada as a language goes back more than 2,500 years, right? And it has won the highest amount of Jnanapeeth awards, which is the highest literary award for Indian languages. And Kannada, the poets from of this language have won it 7 times, and this is one of them who's won it, including people like Girish Karnad. So really, the literary figures of Bangalore, of the language Kannada, and how they've won the highest awards nationally. But really, all this boils down to the king of the erstwhile Mysore state, Krishna Javadiyar, who really known for his vision, a visionary king who really put Mysore on the map, which is the kingdom that ruled the erstwhile Mysore kingdom that also ruled Bangalore. Like a lot of us, whether it was building of dams, whether it was the universities, whether it was the factories that he set up, really a visionary king, right? Called Krishna Javadiyar. But probably his most important contribution to this region was electricity. In fact, Bangalore was the first city in the whole of Asia to have electricity, and including street lights. Well, what was the reason that Bangalore was the first city in the whole of Asia to have electricity? Well, the reason was found in Kolar. It was gold. In fact, one of the highest deposits of gold in the whole world was in this region. And to mine this, they needed electricity. And that's when the Maharaja would send his brightest engineers to America, to Niagara Falls. Why? Because Niagara was the first place on the planet to produce electricity using water. And after they studied the hydroelectric project there, they came back to set up the first hydroelectric project, not just in India, but in the whole of Asia. The General Electric turbine came from England to the coast of Karnataka, and then on elephant backs it was taken to this place called Shivanasamudra, and then the first transmission line was drawn from Shivanasamudra all the way to the Kolar gold mines. In fact, back then it was the longest transmission line in the world. And then, like I said, Bangalore got electricity, and I'm guessing this is also one of the reasons why the Maharaja decided to have like 100,000 light bulbs even on his palace. This, in my opinion, was like a watershed moment for Bangalore, right? Because with the coming of electricity, what you also saw this visionary king do was a lot of impetus on education. When the famous Indian saint Swami Vivekananda was going to Chicago for this famous speech in the International Religion Congress, on the same ship was Mr. Jamshedji Tata, the famous industrialist. And Vivekananda impressed upon him the need for technical education for Indians. And that's how Jamshedji Tata went on to set up the Tata Institute, today known as the Indian Institute of Sciences, by a generous donation of land for free by the Maharaja of Mysore. Right? But when you're seeing educational institutions of prominence that have propped up in Bangalore, what did this give rise to with electricity and education was industries. This is an old photograph of HAL, which is Hindustan Aeronautics Laboratory, set up in the 1940s for the manufacture of airplanes. It's just not just HAL, you had a series of such industries set up, whether it was BHL, BEML, HMT, BL, the list goes on, including the Indian Space Research Organization. And all of them trace their origins to Bangalore. But think of this for a moment, right? Is there another city on the planet where gold has really transformed its future? Well, San Francisco. In the 1850s, you had a massive gold rush in San Francisco. You had a certain entrepreneurial kind who got there to dig gold. That, coupled with access to great education in places like Stanford and Berkeley, gave rise to an entire new economy, the knowledge economy, and which is why San Francisco went on to become the Silicon Valley of the world. The story is not too different here in Bangalore, the Silicon Valley of the East. It was gold coupled with great education that gave rise to the Silicon Valley in this part of the world. The one thing that both these cities also shared was great weather. But the one thing that California got, because the gold rush in Bangalore did not, was the famous Levi's jeans. But apart from that, I'm guessing the story is the same, right? This is San Francisco and Bangalore, like I call sister cities, the goal that really determined the future of these cities that eventually became Silicon Valleys of the world and India respectively. But take a look at this. This is a map of Bangalore from the 1940s to the 2000s, and how industries really sprung up, right? Sprung up in Bangalore. With this, we move on to the fourth city of Bangalore, right? From old Bangalore to British Bangalore to traditional Bangalore to what I call the modern day Bangalore, the Silicon Valley city, the tech city. One of the earliest multinational companies that set base in Bangalore was Texas Instruments in 1985. And here you can actually see a bullock cart carrying some of the earliest machines. From the 80s what you got to see was a technology revolution. Companies such as Wipro and Infosys, who really went on to pioneer the global outsourcing model with TCS. It really changed the way business was being done. Clearly, not just created employment in Bangalore, but really put Bangalore on the forefront as a tech city, as a tech capital, right? Uh, but even with technology, Bangalore has seen its journey. From the initial days of Infosys and Wipro, which just focused on services and the global uh, delivery model, we moved on, right? Today, you're seeing a bunch of these startups, whether it is Ola, Byju's, Flipkart, Inmobi, or even Dunzo. And I'm sure a bunch of them are billion-dollar companies today. And all of them trace their origins to Bangalore, right? There's something about some places which not just give you an impetus with the idea, but also with the right kind of people and the right kind of talent where you could build these tech giants. Right? So you're seeing the growth of Bangalore from the services companies and all the way to what I would call product companies and the new age startups. And a bunch of them have already become unicorns, they say. But there's more to the Bangalore tech story, right? Um, this is a chain. This is a food chain called California Burritos, and those are the three American co-founders of California Burrito. I was curious, and I did ask one of them when I met them, what made them start a burrito chain in India. And they said the future was in China or in India. We couldn't speak Mandarin, so here we are in India, setting up a burrito chain. And I was curious. I wondered. I asked them if Indians like a burrito, and he says, of course. They like roti, they like rajma, they like chawal. That's exactly what we give them. And that, I think, in a lot of ways was homecoming, where you saw in the 80s and 90s and also early 2000s, Indian talent going to different parts of the world to not just work in technology, but also set up businesses. But now you're seeing it the other way around. Bangalore today sees a lot of expat population who are not just working in some of these tech companies, but also starting up on their own. Um, to end, let me leave you with this little exercise. Call it a day in Bangalore. And imagine your day in Bangalore where you start your day in the oldest part of town. Go to Chickpet, go to Kiar Market at 6 o'clock in the morning. That's when you're seeing the flower auctions, and it's absolute riot of colors, and it's an experience of a lifetime to go see the flower auctions going on in Chickpet, our first city of Bangalore. Move on from Chickpet and the market. Why don't you go to traditional Bangalore, get yourself some great South Indian breakfast, some masala dosas and some filter coffee to go with it, right? And why don't you come into the cantonment side of Bangalore, the British Bangalore, to enjoy some beer and some delicacies, right? And to end your day, why don't you either head to UB City or the World Trade Center, either at one of these microbreweries or these rooftop bars, to call it a day. In one day in the city of Bangalore, you're not just experiencing one city, but four different and distinct cities within the city. Let me end with this. They say India lives in its past, present, and the future. And I feel it is nowhere as true as it is in Bangalore, right? With this, uh, let me come to an end. Thank you for your patience. Um, it was great presenting the four cities of Bangalore to you all.